Let's take a look at how to create wavy or curly fur. Now, this is something that definitely foils a lot of people, and people really struggle with it. The way that I come about it is by looking at the overall areas of light and dark. And if you haven't already, please do start off with the lesson done in HB pencil. It will really help you because those techniques are much easier to come at in only one pencil, and especially a familiar medium such as a HB pencil, and then coming into it with pastel should feel a little bit easier, and you should have a better idea of how we're going to build this effect up. Now, I use this technique a lot for things like spaniel ears, which is actually what we're going to be looking at today, this reference photo from Unsplash where we have a spaniel's ear. Now, I'm not drawing the actual ear, but I'm going to draw curls inspired by this, and we'll just create an area of fur instead. So if I just start off by giving myself a nice little section to fill in. And I'm going to be using a selection of Faber Castell and Stabilo Carbothello pencils to create this. I'm working today on the Kanzen midtones velvet paper, the sandy colour, and this isn't for any particular reason. It's that or pastelmat for me normally. I just happen to have a nice bit of this hanging around. Okay, so I'm working first with the 177 from Faber Castell, the walnut brown, and like we did with the HB pencil study, I'm going to start with my pencil on the side, and what you're looking for are the darks. This is how I approach it, and for me it makes the most sense. So I have a look at my reference photo and I get a general idea for the tightness of the curls, how much of an individual curl we can see, how thick they are, how deep the shadows are, and I use this idea to create an area of curls, but I don't necessarily copy everything exactly. Apart from anything else, it would take me a really, really long time, and I tend to get really bored, so I much prefer just looking at something and creating my own version. So I'm starting with some deep shadows, and you can see I'm now lifting my pencil as I get to an area which is going to be lifted away from the ear and catching more light. Maybe the left-hand side of this clump of fur, because curls are made up of usually of multiple hairs clumped together. Maybe that's in shadow, and this edge is lit. You can see that in the photo. You can see that happening because the light is coming in from this direction. So I'm still kind of using the side of my pencil. And this might make more sense to you if you watch this through first and then watch it through again in an attempt to use the technique, because you can see how it's going to build up. So it starts off as something kind of abstract. So I keep looking at my reference photo and thinking about where the shadows are. Now, something that I spoke about in the HB pencil version, which again, if you haven't done, please go and give that a go because it will help a lot, is how I often see people who begin drawing fur for the first time and they come to wavy fur. I often see them draw like an S shape for the curl going from top to bottom like this. It could be a different shape, but literally just drawing lines, and they go down the whole length of the ear and then they kind of shade them in. So they try and build up a clump by creating individual lines and then packing them really tightly together to build up an area. But what you actually want to start with are no details and just instead an underpainting of general lights and general darks. So using the side of the pencil allows me to get some soft markings. I like to think about how curls interact with each other. So again, we wouldn't just be able to see one hair from start to finish like this. It would get crossed here and there by other clumps of fur and other curls. In this particular photo, we can unusually see quite a lot of the fur from start to finish on the ear. Usually they are a little bit more interwoven with each other. But in this instance, we can actually see quite long strands of fur, but even so, they are interlacing each other. So I'm still sweeping my pencil on and off the page. Softness is going to save you here, and we can hide a multiple of sins in very, very soft shadows. So really sweep that pencil on and off the page to create soft edges. So if you've done the Curly Fur workbook with the HB pencil, this will be looking fairly familiar to you at this point, because this is where the Curly Fur workbook leaves you, if you like. We create a swatch, but obviously just using one pencil instead of using different colours. So we're effectively starting off with that last exercise from the Curly Fur workbook, creating the areas of shadow and leaving the paper as the areas of light with just one pencil. And then we will have a look at how we're going to use other colours to build this into sections of coloured curls. You have to be quite trusting in the process to start with, because it looks so abstract, but you will start to create some lovely shapes. It does take a little bit of practice, and I often say it has a lot to do with thinking as much as it has to do with drawing. Because if we think about curly fur, you don't think of it like that as a flat sort of squiggle on the page. We think of it as areas of fullness instead. And we think of, if you think about trying to, touch curly fur and get your fingers into that fur, you would know that there are going to be multiple strands and that your fingers would kind of get caught on them because they're interlacing. Whereas if you think about touching fur like that, it would almost be like spaghetti. It doesn't convey the subject that we are trying to draw. Instead, this has already, although it's very abstract at this stage, it has an idea of fullness. So, much like we did in the lesson previous to this one, which is the so-called basic fur technique, where we looked at creating a section from a fox portrait, I'm now going to start to model out of the shadows. So I'm using the 169, and what we're doing is working over the soft edge, so you're working into that first pencil and then slightly out into the naked paper, just a little bit. And we're starting to go from our darkest dark into colour. And I'm using a reduced pencil palette for these videos, just to try and simplify things a little bit. There will still be quite a lot of pencils that I use, but nonetheless, I'm going to be somewhat restrained. So you'll see me use the same pencils for this. Another pencil that works really well to take us from our dark browns out into our midtones is the 283, also from Faber Castell. It's a bit more red and it is a bit lighter, but it's another pencil that I trust for this kind of process. Using a reddish brown really helps to warm things up and round things out. So I'm not covering up too much of the card, but I'm using this like a blending tool. Again, really sweeping the pencil on and off the page as I work so that I have soft edges. That is so important when you're doing curly or wavy fur. This underpainting stage will rely on a lot of softness. So you can start to model the shapes that we have begun to create here. You might get rid of some, you might cut some up, and they change and morph as we continue to draw. So I'm trying to sweep my pencil in the direction of the fur, so basically the direction that I've already established with that first layer, so that we get some nice fluidity. Remember, it's about the lay and the length. Okay. So you can see how this has started to make the shapes feel a little bit more 3D at this stage. So we need a mid-tone pencil now, and I often turn to this particular pencil for warm browns. This is the 182 from Faber Castell. Now, I will just say I'm working on, as I mentioned at the beginning, the velvet paper from Cans and Me Tints. The velvet paper is quite grainy in comparison to traditional pastel mat. I say traditional because pastel mat has been varying in its quality, and this is recorded in 2025. There have been, I think, issues with it, but it's usually a smoother surface, whereas this is a bit more gritty, and the Faber Castell pencils are hard pencils. Because of that, they don't sit into the tooth of this card quite as well as they do on the pastel mat. So you can see that my underpainting is still a little bit gritty, but we will be able to fill it in as we go along. So what I'm doing is still sweeping the pencil on and off the page, because as I said, this all relies on really lovely soft edges, and I'm filling in the rest of the paper. If you look at your own curly fur work, if it's not working out for you particularly well, then you might have found that you're doing something like this, but you'll have probably also not included quite enough soft edges. You might not have done an underpainting. As I mentioned, a lot of people just seem to get caught up in trying to create the complicated curls and twirls that we see, but you might have also just created too many lines, and therefore you've not got this softness, which, as I've said, gives it a nice fullness. So if your curls are feeling flat, you need to look at your underpainting stage, and you need to look at how soft the transitions are, or potentially aren't. It's all a game of practice. It will come over time, and it's also about training your eye to see shapes and to mimic an idea of something. As you can tell, I do not copy exactly what I'm seeing at all, but I can create a feeling of it. All right, so at this stage, this is when I go back through usually, especially as I'm working on the velvet paper, and I just fill things in a little bit more, particularly those very deep shadows, just to get rid of a bit of the grit of the paper. Still going to focus on soft edges, and I'll just fast forward through this bit and meet you back. Okay, so I've just gone back over with the same 3 pencils, and I've re-established effectively the shapes that I've already devised. This is something that I do often do with my own pet portraits, go through, effectively kind of sketch out the shadows and then commit to them a bit more. I have also edited shapes as I've gone along. I might have added some more deeper shadows just to break up shapes a little bit, to change the curve. But you can see it's quite a fluid underpainting. We have the effect of these moving lines, and they're catching the light. And that is the most important thing to try and visualize, is the idea of the fur coming out and catching the light and dipping back down. And as it dips back down, we go into these reddish browns, which transport us into our darkest dark. So it's a really soft transition, and that reddish brown, particularly for this colouring, it will help with the idea of fullness. So it's really quite important. Once we've done that, we're ready to start moving on to our details. Now, this is a little bit different to what we did with the HB pencil. With the HB pencil, when we got to this underpainting stage, we were working both in the shadows and the mid-tones, but basically leaving quite a lot of the fullness of the curve around here empty, because I was relying on the white of the page for that particular situation. What we're going to do now instead is actually start in the fullness of the curve, but with a mid-tone pencil, or slightly lighter really. This is the 620 from Stabilo Carbothello. Now, just like we did with the HB pencil, we want to think about fluid lines that are following the general curve of that area of underpainting. So for example, this is making such a shape, okay? I'm not suddenly going to come in and create a really bulging curve over the top or a straight line. I'm going to try and follow the curve that has already been established here. Just like we did with the HB pencil exercises, I'm also looking at creating multiple lines to describe a curl instead of one curving line from start to finish. Even though you can really see on this photo the hairs you can see quite a lot of length on them, I'm still going to build it up in multiple strokes, and it will add to a feeling of fluidity. It can very quickly become heavy and stiff if you start to make too many particularly long curling lines, and it's also much harder to get your lines to flow together properly. If I was to do lots of really long lines, it would be quite difficult to get them to have the same kind of curve. Whereas I can work in one area quite easily with these smaller markings and allow them all to kind of interact with each other in a similar manner. Keep that curve quite uniform as I go. So you can see this is just having a nice soft effect over that underpainting. It's just starting to gently build it up. So much like we did with the basic fur technique with that fox, where we just slowly started to get lighter, that is exactly what we're doing with our pencil choice. As I said in that fox tutorial, there are many different ways to draw fur with pastel pencils. I don't always draw it in this way, going from dark to lighter to our lightest light. There are different ways that we can use them, but especially when we're starting out, I think it's a bit easier to have a darker underpainting and then work over the top with our lighter pencils. So I'm thinking about breaking up these clumps, making sure that they are separated to some degree and allowing that underpainting to show through. I'm adding more marks and pressing slightly harder in areas which are lighter. You can see I am leaving those really deep shadows pretty much well alone. I'm going over areas where we've just got a little bit of that red-brown, but I'm not covering up lots of the 177. Here and there, this pencil will trail over the top, just like it did then, of a particularly dark shadow, but I am effectively leaving them blank. And this is where, again, it comes back to that underpainting being sufficiently soft. If it's soft, then it allows these details to just really quietly disappear into a shadow, and they feel nice and full, as I keep saying. But if you haven't got it particularly soft, you end up with too many hard edges. Then you'll find yourself wanting to put details over the top of those shadows because they feel empty. Getting a bit lighter, or quite a lot lighter, but also moving into yellow. I do apologise, I had to change my battery on the camera and failed to press record. So we've now moved to the Stabilo Carbothello 690. So this is a lot lighter, and obviously it's more yellow too. And you can often do that if you've got reddish browns in the darks, then you can move into orange for the mids and yellow for the light, and it works quite well. So I'm working in effectively the centre, the bulging part of the curls. I'm thinking about where the light is hitting. So as I said, the light's coming in from the right hand side. So you can see I've lit the right hand side, particularly of this curl. I've not lit both sides of this clump of fur equally. I've made the right hand side a little bit lighter. So this is where your visualization skills really come into play, and just thinking about the information that we have in the reference photo. So here, of course, I'm thinking about the length of the fur. I'm thinking about how thick it is, or fine. It is fairly fine, but it's clumped together to give the effect of thicker fur, but it's made, of course, of multiple fine strands. I've got the lighting coming in quite severely from the right-hand side as well, so I can really start to build up the lighting at this stage. Now, because we've got a little study, it's a little bit odd to build up the local lighting. It can be a bit tricky. It doesn't always make very much sense, but nonetheless, it helps me. All of this information, it's all stuff we can think about, and it can really help to build a better picture by the end. So this curl over here, for example, that I'm still working with multiple pencil marks. I'm being very, very soft with my pencil. Again, it's moving before it hits the page, and it's moving while it leaves the page. So we're still thinking about those lessons that we covered right back in the first class with the HB pencils. I will keep mentioning those classes, because if you skip them because you think they're boring, you might be right, but they are really, really important. So if you're struggling with your pencil work, start with those lessons. They should really help. Now, there are all sorts of different colours that we could look to get into this particular portrait, but as I said, I'm going to be using a somewhat reduced pencil palette for these lessons, just slightly, just so that we can focus more on the technique for the different types of fur in terms of how we're putting the markings down. We will still be, as I've already done, talking about colour. We'll still be talking about colour, but we won't be focusing on that quite as much. We're really thinking about the technique. All right, so we've got a bit lighter. Now we can get a lot lighter. So for this specific photo, we've only got a few areas which are quite a lot lighter. I'm going to use the 681, which is that pink, and hopefully you can see that there is a really lovely soft pinky tinge to areas which are really catching the light. So again, you can really see, just like we did with the fox tutorial, you can work pink into fur that has reds and oranges quite happily. It works really, really nicely. And this pink from Stabilo is such a soft pink. It's so desaturated. We haven't got very much pigment in it, that it doesn't overtake. So it does sit there a little bit more, in my opinion, like a warm grey. Now we're starting to work on the wispy bits now, really. These are those little details that can start to just buck the trend a little bit and maybe not quite follow the exact shape. Maybe they're little wisps that are just sticking out from the overall clump of curly fur. Still lifting that pencil. Just going to swap cheekily to my Desert Rose, the 042 from Caran d'Ache, just to get this bit to show up a bit brighter. Definitely going a bit overboard with these details, but it is so tempting because they're so good fun. Okay, so just like we did with our basic fur technique, now that we've gone all the way through to our lightest light, we might want to go back through with some of our darker values. So I'm going in here with the 169, and this is that warm reddish brown. Now I'm using this as though I were adding in individual fur markings instead of shading. And you can see I'm working on the left-hand side of these clumps of fur, again just helping to establish that lighting coming in from the right instead. I'm fairly happy with most of this, and it is, again, it's just a study anyway, but by just increasing the contrast and adding a little bit more shadow to the right hand side of these markings, it can just help bring in a little bit more fullness to the work. If there's any points where the darkest dark is not fully filled in, which particularly on this slightly gritty velvet paper, that definitely has occurred, I would definitely encourage you on your final pieces to make sure that you have fully filled in those really dark darks. Otherwise they won't feel solid and it can really hold your work back. And it's quite a simple fix really, just to go in and make sure that the darks are properly established. You can of course edit your curls at any point by literally, I often say, eating into them with a shadow, maybe making them smaller. And obviously you can bring more curls in if you want to by adding more of your light values over the top. So I'm going to leave this at this stage. I'm really hoping that this has shown you how we can use those basic techniques from the exercise book and work them up with a small selection of pencils in reddish browns to get to something that feels like it has a lovely sense of fullness. If this was over an entire ear, you would also need to think, of course, about the fact that on this particular photo, the curls on the left-hand side, as I keep saying, they're going to have less light. So these curls, if these were right at the back of the ear, we probably wouldn't need to go all the way to our lightest light. Whereas the curls right at the front of the ear, you can see in this photo, some of them actually have areas which don't have any of these dark values at all and just need our lighter values. So this is where you really need to think about the values, the lights and darks right at the beginning of your drawing and work on that visualization of how that's going to transfer to your piece of paper. Where do we need these dark shadows and how can we maximize the light best? Remember also that we want those really soft transitions with our underpainting. If we don't have a soft transition, we're more likely to end up with something like this at the end. Don't worry if this is your starting point, everybody starts here, but It's thinking about how we get to this stage by using those different pencil techniques and really visualising the subject that we are trying to emulate on the page. I hope you've enjoyed this. Do remember that there are ebooks to go with these classes, and they are available to download with the reference photo, the link, as well as your materials.